man. Welcome to On Democracy with F.P. Wellman. I am Fred Wellman, your host, coming to you from the now chilly suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri, also bucolic. As always, we are sponsored by our friends at Vi Media. Vi Media, of course, is your award-winning, no words, digital marketing agency based right here in Greater St. Louis. They're your partner in every industry you're in, from St. Louis, nationwide. They can serve all your digital marketing needs. You can find them at vie.media, VIE.media. I hope you check them out. They're good friends of us, and I appreciate their support. Man, you know, the midterms look like they might be about done. I don't know. We'll see. Got a lot to talk about today. I got an incredible guest on the show. I'm so excited to have a friend on again. With that, let's just get on with the show. Welcome. As mentioned, I am your host, Fred Wellman. I'm so glad to have you here on the show once again this week, live back in the studio again after being on the road in Georgia last week for the midterms. It ended up being super fun, but now I'm home where I belong. This is the show where we talk with smart people who are fighting for our democracy across this great country and, you know, frankly, around the world. I think the midterms technically are still going a little bit. You know, there's still some races being counted. It hasn't actually been settled yet. It's looking like our friends in the Republican Party will get control of the House. It's looking like a very thin margin, so we should expect a complete mess. We did hold the Senate. Everything I'm reading, as we mentioned last week in the show, it looks like President Biden may have one of the most successful first-term midterm elections of any president since the 30s. In addition, well, somewhere like top three, if you will, and that's all good. But you know what? As we left the midterms behind, I've really wanted to start talking about a little bit of hot wash of what just happened and what it means, but also our larger democratic issues. Of course, President Trump announced he's going to run for election again last night, which is always a mess. So I was looking for a guest. I was fishing around. Some people told me no. I've been wanting to get my friend Tony Messenger on the show forever. And so he is going to join us today. Tony Messenger is the Metro columnist of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. In 2019, Tony won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary for a series of columns on debtors, prisons in Missouri. 2016, Messenger was awarded a Missouri Honor Medal, highest award bestowed by the University of Missouri's School of Journalism. If you know the Mizzou School of Journalism, one of the top journalism schools in the country. Same year, he won a national headliner for editorial writing, and on and on and on with awards. He recently published his first book, Profit and Punishment, which is right here on the desk. It digs deeper into the way America criminalizes the poor in the name of justice. It's a great book. I can't recommend it enough. We will talk about it a little bit. Now he started learning journalism, man, across the country. Let's see, Tony, Colorado, Arizona, Nebraska, South Dakota. Started off in Yuma, Colorado. Been in Missouri since, I think 1999, if I'm right. So where he now works at a number of the leading newspapers, but now he's arrived at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where he serves as a Metro columnist. We are neighbors. Tony, welcome to the show. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having me, Fred. It's good to be in the virtual studio in Creve Coeur.
Pretty cool, right? I know.
Looks pretty cool. I like it.
Yeah, it's funny.
I like the book placement. Thank
you like that?
By St. Martin's Press thanks you for that lovely placement.
Thank you. I hope I get a check. As you can see from
I say that every time I go to the mailbox.
Yes.
Am I going to get a check?
Where's my check? Where's my check? Well, you know, it's such a profitable business writing books. Of course, I love the book. This is actually my galley copy you sent me, which is a funny story. I always love having folks I know on, and we always tell the story of how we met. And for those who don't know, Tony and I are both here in St. Louis, and I moved here, August of last year, and the book was just getting ready to come out, and I had been Tony had did a really great column about Afghanistan, and I at that time was actually kind of helping some of our Afghan refugee organizations here in St. Louis. Had some free time in my hands after that last job I had, and he DM'd me, "Hey, I've got this book coming out. I'd love to send you a copy." I said, "Yeah, man, yeah, no problem. I'd love to get it." He goes, "I can mail it to you." I said, "I'm pretty sure we live across the street from each other," you know, because as it turns out, my girlfriend lives right in the same neighborhood just about that Tony does. So instead, we met for a beer, and we keep meeting for beers. So it's good to have you.
It's a good thing.
Good to have you here on the show, man. So much going on.
Beer is not just for breakfast anymore.
That is true, and we do enjoy it. And I don't drink as much, and you always give me shit about drinking cider, which is fine. I still respect you. Yeah. You know, and I appreciate you coming in here at the last minute, and I've been eager to have you on, as I mentioned. Obviously, your perspective is so unique on Missouri, the national trends, and of course, especially your work on our broken judicial system. And the reason I wanted to have you on the show, and people may ask why, as a Metro columnist who writes about crime and punishment a lot on a show about democracy, man, you cannot get to a more important topic on our democracy than this third pillar of our democracy, the third pillar of our government, right? Legislative, executive, and then our judicial. And our judicial structure is broke as hell. And Tony is truly an expert on this, but in addition, he has a unique perspective on all the politics. So, I'm not going to dork around. Let's just get right to it, Tony, as we talked about. I think we should start with the midterms. One of the things I've been hammering a lot repeatedly is that, the GOP's at the end there, and those last few months was really hammering the crime fear, the mongering of fear about crime. It seems to have failed. In your newest column, it goes right at that topic, since even in St. Louis City, where, obviously crime is a perennial issue here in our city, it's flattened, actually. It's declining in many ways. And candidates that were tagged as soft on crime actually won. I believe the Board of Aldermen president was kind of getting hit by being soft on crime because she was looking at criminal justice reform. Do you think voters saw through the bullshit messaging about crime? And how do you see that from your perspective as a writing about it?
I do, and that's what I wrote in today's column, and I think there's a connection both locally and nationally, because St. Louis is one of those cities that there was a theme that Republicans were trying to push, and that is that Democrats are causing crime to rise. Look at all of the Democratic cities in which there's high crime. Never mind that many of those cities are in Republican states that also have very high crime, even in the non-urban areas. But the point was to drive fear, to scare people. And the numbers that Republicans were using were from the pandemic.
Right.
The crazy thing that that political scientists and criminologists and all sorts of folks who study these things are going to be busy doing for the next 10, 20 years is looking at how the pandemic changed everything.
Yep.
And crime rose in a lot of places related to the pandemic. But last year in St. Louis, in 2021, the first year of a new progressive mayor, Tashara Jones, crime dropped and homicides dropped. And St. Louis was relatively unique in 2021 because other cities were still dealing with a post-pandemic rise.
Right.
Well, I decided to take a look after the midterms at the local stats. And once again, if you compare end of October to end of October in St. Louis, homicides have dropped again. And crime in almost all major violent categories has dropped. There is one place in that is consistent in cities because of a flaw in the Kia and Hyundai cars. Auto thefts are through the roof in a lot of these cities. But I talked to Rick Rosenfeld, a criminologist at UMSL who studies these things in St. Louis and around the country. And he said, indeed, the actual statistics are so completely different than what the fear-mongering was around the election in terms of, oh my God, crime's out of control in our cities. In fact, crime, specifically violent crime, specifically homicides, is down in 2022 in most American cities. Now, that doesn't mean it's not too high. It doesn't mean that my colleague who got her car stolen the other day isn't a victim of crime. It doesn't mean that those real things haven't happened, that people who live in downtowns in cities all over the country aren't dealing with the fact that there aren't as many people downtown as there used to be because of the pandemic. And therefore, some of the crime is magnified because there isn't as much density, and that sort of density tends to lead to safety in numbers and that sort of thing. So crime is a very real thing, and it's a thing that people get emotional about. But my point of the column was that voters, I think, to some degree, saw through it because they either weren't feeling it in their own lives or they paid attention to things other than just the fear-mongering. But the reality of the results is, whether it's in a Democratic primary like we had in St. Louis for the Board of Aldermen race, or whether it is in the national races for governor and Senate, in which Democrats won when Republicans were pushing a crime fear theme. That's telling, and it says something about the state of America. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the column is just to say, hey, look, the data has to matter at some point.
Right.
That's the problem that I think we have in so much of our politics these days, is that words don't matter anymore. Trumpism has sort of changed the reality of what some people think. Oh, Donald Trump said it. Oh, therefore that's what I saw it on Fox News. I saw it on Newsmax. It must be true. Never mind what the actual data says. And the other corollary, I didn't write about this in my column, but I was thinking about it as I'm writing, that I think fits with the midterms. The other big loser in the election was anybody who really pushed the big lie.
Right.
All of the Secretary of State candidates, Republicans, all of the gubernatorial candidates, Republicans, who really pushed the big lie hard, they all lost.
Yep.
And so American voters said something in this election. It wasn't just protecting democracy. It was, tell us the truth.
Yep.
What's the truth about what's going on in our nation? And how can I, as a voter, have an impact? And voters had a really big impact on this midterm. I mean, it's a historic midterm, even if the Democrats end up losing the House. And frankly, if they lose it by 2 or 3, I would argue they're actually better off going into 2024, because now all of a sudden, President Joe Biden and the Democrats have an actual villain and a daily villain, and not just whatever weirdness the former president is pushing on a given day, because there's going to be real weirdness happening in the daily headlines in a House in which Republicans won't actually be able to pass anything.
And that's what I said too. That's what I said.
And so actually, I think Nancy Pelosi may be the current Speaker of the House, may be a little bit pleased, actually, if she's not the speaker for the next couple of years, because of what it might mean politically in 2024, because having a villain makes a difference in politics.
Well, and the thing is, I mentioned it in my last week's episode, is they're going to have, you already see it. Marjorie Taylor Greene held a Capitol, had a press conference at Capitol and was getting a million questions. They have to elevate Marjorie Taylor Greene. They're going to have to elevate, if Boebert wins, they're going to have to elevate Matt Gaetz. They're going to have to elevate Biggs, Gosar, the Freedom Caucus of you guys, the most extremist members of the Congress, of the House for the Republican caucus. They desperately need to do anything. If they only have 3 votes or more of a majority. I mean, the thing is, too, they may not, in a 435 person Congress, not everybody's there for work every day, right? So, I mean, it's one of the challenges they've had in the Senate is they've had, the Senate, senators get sick or whatever, they miss votes. You need a strong majority. They have a razor thin majority. And I've got a feeling that if Miss Pelosi does stay in Congress, she's going to hold her caucus is going to be just fine. And they're going to stay disciplined. They've been, the one thing you can say for the last 2 years, the normal Democratic caucus is like herding cats. Man, these cats have been really well herded the last 2 years, right? There's been very little of the infighting here and there, but I think you're going to see a very strong Democratic caucus, a disciplined Democratic caucus. If they can hold their discipline on the Democratic side, they're going to be able to do a lot of things. Kind of like our friend Crystal Quaid here in Missouri, right? You can do a lot as a minority, but like you said, what we're going to do, and me as a political operative is going to do, man, I'm going to get all these clips of every time Marjorie Taylor Greene goes on, now going to be on a committee, saying her crazy stuff. Gosar, these guys, I'm going to run those clips just like they have for years, running clips of AOC, right? We're going to do the same thing to them. So I think you're right. It's not great for the country. I wish we would win, but I do think you're right. We have someone now on our side. But I want to keep pulling the thread, too, on that crime narrative, right? And get to your book a little bit, because in your book, Profit and Punishment, it's really a gutting read and explores. That's very subtle for those watching. Look at that. That's very good marketing.
Actually, a little bit of
Did they teach you that?
So
They did. For those listening, Tony is shamelessly parading his book on camera. It's a gutting read, and explores how our judicial system essentially punishes being poor through the eyes. And you do this through the eyes of 3 single mothers and their journeys through the process. It's not a happy at times. But at the core of it is a system that takes Americans convicted of relatively minor crimes and then saddles them with fines and fees that they're unable to pay. which leads them to jail and then even more fines and fees. And it's an endless cycle. And, there's a growing criminal justice reform movement, which is what you talk about today, that's attacking, for example, they just filed a lawsuit attacking the cash bail system in Los Angeles, the second largest city in America. They're trying to get, it has the largest cash bail system. But, what else can be done to reform this mass machine? And I mean, it undermines our democracy when it's part of this divide I think we face, where the being poor is punished, right, versus those that haves and the have nots. That leads to things like, I think, Donald Trump's. So, talk to me a little bit about what you pull from profit and punishment. What does it mean for us as a democracy?
So one of the things that really drew me to this topic, to criminal justice reform, as you know, I've written a lot about politics in my career,
Yes,
primarily in Missouri, but there is probably not another single topic that I've covered in the last decade or so that has more potential for there being a bipartisan flavor to it than criminal justice reform, and particularly around the area of how the criminal justice system treats poor people,
right,
and how it uses the courts to raise backdoor taxes on the backs of poor people through these court costs. And what profit and punishment does is it follows these poor people who end up committing minor crimes. One of my main characters is a woman named Brooke Bergen.
Yep.
She stole an $8 tube of mascara from a Walmart. She ended up doing a year in county jail and owing $15,000 for her bill in jail. Now, some of your listeners are going, wait, what? Every single state in this country has a law that allows cities or counties or states, sometimes all of them do it, sometimes just some of them do it, to charge you like a hotel bill for your time in jail. And when poor people get this bill, what used to happen in Missouri until I started reporting on it and the legislature and the Supreme Court made a change, is that people who couldn't afford to pay their bill for jail ended up back in jail. Now, both liberals and conservatives, for sometimes different reasons, recognize, wait a minute, that's the tyranny of big government.
Right.
You can't take away people's freedom like that. These people we banned debtors' prisons in this country in the 1800s.
Yep.
But when you read Profit and Punishment, you find out the debtors' prisons are alive and well. We call them something else. We say, well, we had to issue a warrant for this person because they didn't pay their fines and fees. And if that person doesn't answer the warrant, misses a court date, doesn't afford to pay their bills, fails a drug test issued by a private for-profit probation company, all of these things contribute to a poor person having a completely different judicial situation than somebody who looks like me or you and has $80 in their pocket and can write a check and not have to be in jail because of bail or whatever else.
Right.
And so it's a fundamental part of our broken system, and all three branches of government are involved. There's a chapter in the book called The Koch Brothers Meets the ACLU. And it's one of my favorite chapters in the book because it talks about how people on the left and people on the right get this. And right now in this country, I wrote a column about it last month. Last month, the ACLU, the Koch brothers, and the Fines and Fees Justice Center started a national campaign on this topic called End Justice Fees. Wow. So the left and the right, again, coming together and saying, we've got to stop putting poor people in jail just because they're poor. And I love this story, this larger story, because I like it when people in the greater political world get beyond the R or the D,
right,
and focus on the issue and realize, hey, wait a minute, lots of us agree on this topic. Yep. We can do some things on this topic if we pass bills that ignore whether or not they're sponsored by a D or an R. And the one area in which there's sort of a political minefield as it relates to the criminalization of poverty, and there shouldn't be, but I'll explain why there is the one that you just mentioned. So Alec Karakasanis with the Civil Rights Corps, which is a nonprofit in D.C.,
yep,
announced yesterday the lawsuit against Los Angeles trying to force bail reform.
Yep.
That same nonprofit was involved in trying to change the statewide constitution in California successfully as it relates to how they abuse poor people over their unconstitutional system of bail.
Yep.
And when you talk about bail reform in politics, there is a clear divide. New York is a good example.
Yep.
And yet, when you do what I did in my column today on crime and you look at the data, the great thing about most of the cities that have passed bail reform, New Jersey as a state, New York as a city, Houston as a city, they have also required in their bills there to be a yearly study that says of the people that are no longer being held on bail, what's the recidivism rate, and are they showing up for court?
Right.
And three things have happened in all the studies on bail reform in the places that have actually reformed the bail system so far. There is not a tick up in recidivism, meaning that bail reform is not driving crime. I know that's a narrative in New York. It's a narrative in Illinois right now.
Driven by their own mayor.
It's not true.
Right.
The actual data doesn't show that it's true. In fact, it shows the opposite. There's no uptick in recidivism. People are showing up for court at about the same percentage as they were when they were stuck in jail.
Yep.
And it works. And meanwhile, there's fewer people in jail. And why do Republicans like this? Because it saves tax dollars. Because when we are the most mass incarcerated country in the world,
yep,
and it's not even close, our tax dollars are paying for that. And if it's not providing for more public safety, why are we doing it?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's encouraging to see that people are getting attuned to this, right? And we have seen you here in Missouri. We did see the reform was, heck, I think Eric Schmidt himself, the guy who just got elected to Senate, was one of the guys who drove and was interested in these reform issues. So I think it's funny. I do get, having read all your work and the reason you got the Pulitzer and all, I have had that sense of optimism that we can find these issues. And it goes to also, Tony, it reminds me of these issues we face here in Missouri on like the national, the state ballot level, right? Like issues that should be left or right, as long as you don't call them that, we tend to pass them, right? Like right, marijuana reform, right? It's like, well, a state that is as red as Missouri should not have just passed a amendment legalizing marijuana, yet here we are, right? If you take away the R and the D and the tribalism that goes with those issues, and then focus on the issues and how they impact us as Americans as a whole, you do, and your work has led to that. It's been a
well. That's one of these places where Missouri is, to some degree, a microcosm of the nation. When I started writing in Missouri was a presidential bellwether state.
Right.
We were a state that actually drew national money,
right,
because we would go back and forth in presidential races between the R and the D, and we were sort of seen as a bellwether.
Yep.
That's no longer the case, but we are still, I believe, a microcosm of the nation, and the marijuana ballot initiative is one of those. So Missouri was one of several states now to legalize marijuana. I think eventually it's going to be nationwide for the most part. Missouri in the last couple of years, despite being almost completely red it's now completely red at the statewide level in terms of statewide elected officials. Yep. Missouri voters have increased the minimum wage. Missouri voters have beat back right to work and protected workers' rights. Missouri voters have legalized first medical marijuana and now recreational adult use marijuana. When ballot issues, Missouri voters passed ethics reform in the state legislature, and then the state legislature by referendum, dishonest referendum, ended up gutting much of that reform. But Missouri voters frequently vote when there isn't a partisan D or an R next to the ballot issue for things that are the exact opposite of the elected Republicans that they're also electing, sometimes in the same election.
Yep.
And it's weird, but I think that's common in the country. I think one of the most important things that happened in the midterm is 5 different states Three of them, I think, relatively liberal, and two of them pretty deep red, including Kentucky, protected women's rights to freedom by either putting abortion rights into their constitution or beating back a statewide constitutional amendment that tried to take away their rights. Yep. Kansas did so previously a couple of months ago in August, I think, in their election.
Yep.
And so that to me is really hopeful when you put these important questions before statewide electorates, whether it's a red state or a blue state. Voters ultimately see through the noise. I wish, for the sake of democracy, Democrats were better at taking advantage of those votes, so that there was a little bit more, balance across the country. But perhaps this midterm is the one that moves us in that direction. I mean, clearly Democrats had a very successful midterm, not just in terms of holding on to the Senate. They turned the state legislature in Michigan, in Colorado, another sort of bellwether state. Democrats won almost everything.
Yep.
Still to be decided whether or not Bobo goes back to Congress. Might even win that race. But
it'd be amazing.
I mean, it was the Democrats made lots of gains, including in Missouri, minor gains in the House, in the state legislature. That's a big deal.
Yeah, and I was going to get to that. I mean, as you know, we both talked to Minority Leader Crystal Quaid. She did pick up a couple competitive state house seats. I think they picked up 3 seats. Unfortunately, they were not able to break the Republican supermajority. For those, by the way, who don't understand how a supermajority works, the way a Republican supermajority works, why we use that term, is Missouri has one of the largest state legislatures in the country. And it does not have those rules where, if you've seen other states where like the Democrats or the Republicans have like left the state and hidden so they couldn't have a quorum. The way the Missouri laws are structured, the Constitution is structured, it doesn't matter if the Dems show up at all. With a supermajority of Republicans, they don't need a single Dem to even show up for work, and they can pass whatever laws they want, which is why we talk a lot about here in Missouri of breaking the quote supermajority. Now, they had some luck last session because there's a couple of Republicans went to jail and they had some people get sick. So in the end, the Republican supermajority, and when it came to actually casting votes, was undermined. And so she made some progress here, but I do see there's some lessons learned. You saw, if we mentioned this Saturday, do you think there's a strategy that can pull the state along back to the middle again? I mean, do you see hope in this turn? I mean, it's hard to see hope. I mean, they did win a state Senate seat here in the county, St. Louis County. You've been here since 1999. Do you see hope in that strategy that Crystal's running candidates in every district, running them in the hard places? I mean, can we pull it back to the center again?
I think that's one of the things that's been missing. So I've written a column twice in the last 2 or 3 election cycles about how few seats in Missouri, both Republican and Democrat, are swing seats and are contested.
Yeah.
So many House members actually run for office uncontested.
Right.
In some Democrat controlled districts and in a significantly higher number of Republican controlled districts. A lot of that is because of really extreme gerrymandering, and unfortunately voters tried to fix that and state lawmakers pushed back. But when you run uncontested elections, so then what happens in that situation is when you're going to the local farm bureau or the local Rotary Club or the local Chamber of Commerce that has its local state reps and county commissioners, and folks come give their little 5-minute talk before the chicken dinners. Every town in America has these sort of gatherings.
Yep.
In Missouri, because so many of those Republican-dominated areas in rural districts don't have contested elections, when the Republican incumbent state rep gets up to talk about the marijuana initiative or the minimum wage initiative or the abortion rights initiative or whatever might be on the statewide ballot that people tend to care about, there's not a Democrat at those meetings to just stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, I think a lot of us actually agree on this topic. I'm going to be voting in favor of this, and here's why. And so they're only getting one side.
Right.
So just going through the process of having contested elections, I think is how you actually build that statewide change. It's actually more of a bottom up than, a top down. In Missouri this year, Democrats at the Senate level tried the opposite. They went and found somebody who could self-fund to run against Eric Schmidt, and she lost. She didn't have any record. She hadn't, she's a nice lady, and I think ran a better general campaign than she did a primary campaign, but learned and got better, but it wasn't sort of bottom up. It was top down,
right,
and lost pretty bad. Meanwhile, the minority leader in the House, Crystal Quaid from Springfield, was trying really hard to recruit local state reps to run at that level. And I really think that's where the change, if you're going to have long-term change, if you're going to have 10-year change, generational change,
right,
that's where it has to happen, because you have to build a bench, you have to build volunteers, you have to get people that are interested. And then all of a sudden, when you have those ballot initiatives, if Missouri, for instance, and I'm sure Democrats are going to try to do this after looking at the midterms, if Missouri Democrats try to get an initiative on the ballot to protect abortion rights in this state, Missouri has one of the most extreme abortion bans in the country, then that's going to make a difference in 2024. But that only makes a difference if you have people running in every district to talk about that at the local chicken dinners.
Right. And I talked to some folks who are from a group called Blue Ohio. David Peppers, you see him on the internet doing his little whiteboard videos, and some others are really good. And they did a study and found that statistically, if a race is competitive, competed at all, in other words, a Democrat and a Republican are both in the ballot, at least on average, 1.5% more people vote in that election, right? They just show up. They will vote either way, which is good for statewide candidates. I say often, and if you heard the show before, I talk about how in Virginia, McAuliffe lost. Everybody blames CRT in Northern Virginia, but if you really unpack the numbers, he lost to rural Virginia, which should have been 35 Dem. It was 20 Dem, and you can't lose 100 counties by 15 points and think you're going to win a statewide office. Here in Missouri, Eric Schmidt. I was unpacking the numbers for Eric Schmidt's win. It was gutting to see something like 35 counties. It was 80-20. Right.
Yeah.
Republican. So you've got
and those aren't people that are voting for Eric Schmidt. Those are people that are voting for the
just
R.
An R. Right. And so, that gets to another issue that I want to unpack along those lines is, you've worked across the state of Missouri and from semi-rural cities all the way here to St. Louis. One of the things I'm seeing nationally that worries me on that same divide is a growing divide between our cities and our rural regions, and the divides economically, politically, educationally, and now here in Missouri, we really are dealing with a healthcare divide as our rural hospitals are closed. And the same thing's happening in Georgia, where I was working recently. So Missouri is a perfect model of this growing divide. Do you see the same trend? Are there any solutions out there along the same line that are even remotely addressing this growing divide? And what's the danger of this growing divide from your perspective, Tony? We live in different worlds in many ways, right?
We do, but we have to find those commonalities.
Okay.
One of the things I write about in Profit and Punishment is how the experience in white, poor, rural Missouri in terms of the interaction with the criminal justice system is very similar to the experience of Black, poor, urban St. Louis in terms of the interaction with the criminal justice system.
Yep. I noticed that in the book myself. Yep.
There's not the racist element that exists that people of color have to deal with, but the idea of the man keeping you down because you're poor and ending up in jail because you owe money in the system is a very common connection between Black and white, between urban and rural. And so from my standpoint, if I were guiding, folks who work in the political realm, I would say you have to find those commonalities. So what are they? So minimum wage passed in Missouri. You talked about healthcare and the closing of rural hospitals. Medicaid expansion passed in Missouri and had to be taken to the ballot because Republicans were blocking it, and was popular in many rural areas. Why? Because grandma and grandpa who live on the farm get sick too. And they don't want to have to be flown in a helicopter or a plane to a hospital in St. Louis, because that costs a lot of money and they may not have insurance, but there's no longer a rural hospital to take care of them.
Right.
And so, the key to me to bridging those divides is finding those topics that matter to folks, regardless of their color, regardless of their socioeconomic background, regardless of whether or not they live in a city or a rural area.
And so that's really great. I mean, I think you're dead on. We have to find our commonalities, and it goes back, segueing back to, or call back to where we were earlier, right? About there are these unique things that bind us, right? Like you said, we do need health, right? We do need a living wage. These are issues that don't have anything to do with a R or a D next to your name, or even a liberal or conservative value. It's basic values and basic humanity between us as Americans. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is hope there. I do hope that as a political operative myself, I agree. And you saw it here in Missouri, right? I think Miss Bush Valentine. And then before her, I think Lucas Kunce, the Senate candidate, was really hammering Eric Schmidt about the Chinese land sales of the farms, and it just absolutely did nothing. I mean, it just there's obvious that, because our very most rural districts that are affected by that just didn't care, right? And those are the ways 80-20. So we do have to do a better job, I think, of understanding the actual lives of these people. It's somebody I talked to. I know Jessica Piper, who ran up in Northwest Missouri in an uphill battle, dirt road Democrat. She calls herself, has really built a following online, well-deserved following, because she speaks the language of a farmer. She's a farmer, but she's also a liberal. And Jess and I were on the phone yesterday talking, lamenting things, lamenting politics.
Yeah.
and Jess is on a mission too, to make people understand there are commonalities that bind us no matter where we happen to live. If we could find those shared values and speak to each other, be it rural or urban or black or white, there might be hope for us. And maybe we dodged a bullet in this one, but there is
the challenge. The challenge for the Democrats there, I think, is to do what I think Jess Piper tried to do, and obviously in terms of her election, it failed pretty badly. But get beyond the demonization of the D.
Right.
We're neighbors. We're friends. You used to be a Republican. I used to vote a very split ticket most of my life in terms of Republican versus Democrat. I'm from Colorado. I'm sort of a traditional Western independent in terms of my politics. And our current environment, influenced tremendously by the former guy, has changed to where one side demonizes the other if you ever consider voting for a D or an R. And we've got to get past that demonization, because bottom line is we're all Americans and we all have those common things. We pay the same amount at the gas pump. We have our kids in the local schools. Those are the things that draw us together. And I think, again, because of the pandemic separating us and keeping so many of us out of social groups that might be mixed politically and otherwise, we've lost that ability to just commune with each other. And we need to find a way to get that back. Our politics as a nation will be much better when we can do a better job of getting back to just being able to talk to each other politely about our differences.
And sit in the baseball stands, just have a friendly conversation about hot dogs again. It seems like even that's hard to do these things. Another thing that is unique, and along those same lines, Missouri is in many ways sort of the birthplace of what is the right-wing media ecosphere, right? I mean, it's home of none other than the rotten godfather of the movement, Rush Limbaugh, right? I mean, Rush Limbaugh got his start on AM radio right here in Missouri, which is, in many ways, you can trace his growth right through to where we are today, where there's an alternative media universe, if you will. how do we fight back against this alternative? I mean, that's what the other thing is. This tribalism is driven by this alternative media. I mean, do you see your colleagues? Do your colleagues, for example, see the risk and the danger? I mean, I know we're facing falling revenue. Obviously, newspapers are in trouble. You work in the business, right? Is it possible for the existing media to take on this fight and understand the danger we're in? I mean, I was very frustrated. I think I've expressed it multiple times with how the right-wing talking points about the economy, about crime, became mainstreamed by our political press, without question, if you will, and it hurt us when we found out later the issue still was the same. It was abortional. So, I mean, you as a member of the community, you've been a journalist for your life. I mean, do you think our media is up to the task, or is there hope there, or should we continue to worry? Because I do beat them up pretty hard.
Well, I worry. I share some of your fears about the national political media.
Yeah.
And I think that the horse race coverage really takes away from the reality of just telling the American people what's going on. And I do think the media in general has to do a better job of that. There's a journalism professor named Jay Rosen who I follow on Twitter, who writes a lot about this.
Yep.
And he's been on that for years, and he's completely right. And the problem is there's so fewer of us. Doing really strong issues-based political coverage is hard work. And there's fewer of us in newsrooms than there used to be. Horse race coverage is easy because somebody calls you and says, I got a poll. It's a bullshit poll, but I got a poll. And well, I can get a headline out of that, and I can write, 10 inches out of that. And all of a sudden, somewhere at the bottom of the story, there's a line that says, yeah, this poll might be bullshit, but and unfortunately that drives, I think, a little bit too much of our national political coverage. The problem with the solution to the right-wing atmosphere, I think, is actually in the courts. Rush Limbaugh begat Gateway Pundit, which is based here in St. Louis and contributes to a lot of the national right-wing blogosphere lies, pushes the big lie, pushes all sorts of really horrible things. Well, Gateway Pundit is being sued in federal court right now over the damage that it did to people's individual lives in Georgia, going back to related to the big lie.
Right.
And it's similar to what you're seeing with the Dominion libel lawsuits against Fox, against One News Network, against Newsmax. Those things are going to have an impact and eventually cost right-wing media companies enough money that they will have to adjust. And I think that's really the solution. I've been, as a journalist my entire life, schooled in the world of libel and how to avoid it, and how to focus on the truth and how to be fair. And it's protected me and the companies that I've worked for well. The right-wing blogosphere doesn't pay attention to that. And I'm hoping that these lawsuits are successful enough. The lawsuits that the Newtown parents brought against Alex Jones and costing him about $1 billion or more. Eventually that stuff has to have an impact. Eventually that business model has to change. We have to take away the financial incentive to lie. And I really think the courts are probably going to be the place where that has to be fixed.
Oh, I agree. I think that's great insight. And you're right. It is, until we break the hold of it is money. I mean, again, it all circles back to that. There's a market for it. The marketplace drives these decisions, and unfortunately, you are seeing. And there's hopeful signs here. I mean, you got nonprofit like Missouri Independence growing here in Missouri as a nonprofit newsroom. I mean, there is a larger ecosystem being grown that does offer hope. But yeah, it's tough to watch, and I get it. The thing about my problem always, I have a hard time criticizing you and your peers because I'm a huge fan. I'm a journalism guy. I was a public affairs officer in the Army. I saw my mission as to telling the people of America their story of their military, and the journalism media was that conduit. So it pains me greatly to criticize my people I enjoy working with so much. But I just having to spend a whole day in Georgia watching, for example, CNN saying, well, the Dems have really failed before a single vote had been counted. The Dems have really failed. They never addressed this economy issue and the crime issue. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Are you sure about that? It was funny watching because at 5 o'clock, they had their first exit polls come in, and they're like, oh, this is weird. The 35% of people said the number one issue was abortion. I mean, it's like, yeah, you spent the entire day telling us we were full of shit. And it's like, okay, it's I get we have to drive these conversations, but it's just frustrating in the way we go about it. Well, this has been a great conversation, Tony. I don't want to drag us out too long. I really appreciate you. Thanks all the work you do. How do people who are following us and have discovered your book, find you, find your book? How do we find more of your great talent?
I'm on Twitter at Tony Mess, TonyMess, and if you check in my profile there, you can see a link to go buy my book. It's available at bookstores everywhere and online and everything else. And I appreciate you giving me a chance to plug it. And God bless our democracy. I hope we continue to hold on to it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of it myself. It's just, I think we've got, I will leave on a hopeful note too. I do think we won. There's, you can say what you will, the House and all, but in the end, we stood against the wind, and a lot of Americans came forward and said, I'm tired of the crazy. I'm tired of the chaos. I'm tired of the lies. One of the things I said, I did a little TikTok video the other day, which is a new thing for me, Tony. You'll appreciate it. Is it was kind of weird, but I was thinking I was in Richmond visiting, and I'll close on this And the thing about Richmond, there's a bridge in Richmond, it's beautiful, and it goes across the James River, and they highlight the fall of Richmond, and it made me think. What's interesting about the fall of Richmond is what you don't see in those words, right? What happened was when Petersburg fell and Lee withdrew, which opened Richmond to falling. Grant didn't go to Richmond triumphantly and do a parade down the middle of the street in Richmond. He skipped Richmond. He chased Lee. And he chased Lee across all the way to Appomattox Courthouse, another 90 miles across Virginia, before Lee finally, when Union troops cut him off his retreat, he finally realized his war was over at that point. And it reminded me that we're at that point as a military strategist and as a democratic activist, that we're in the pursuit right now. We have beaten our enemy, at least a draw, I think. I think we could say we pulled a draw on this one, like Cold Harbor was a draw for the Union Army. Now we have to exploit that. We have to continue to push. I urge my peers and those who care about democracy to continue to pursue our opponents until their demise. Right? It's how Trump's running again. The MAGA movement really took a hit. Carrie Lake lost. It's fantastic. Some of the most extreme members of the MAGA movement lost. Now we have to continue to push them until we remove them from our body politic, because there's no place in our world and our democracy for authoritarianism. So anyway, there's hope for us both, Tony. There's hope for us both. As always, you can find me online, I'm still on Twitter, still holding out there with my friend Elon, FP Wellman. You've got FP Wellman Official on Instagram. I'm putting lots of pictures and now TikTok videos. I'm on TikTok as FP Wellman. You can go all those places. And of course, the podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Google, wherever you find it, Buzzsprout, YouTube. We'd love you to go subscribe. I'd love you to sign up. I'd love you to tell your friends. I'd love you to do a good positive review. No negative reviews. I got enough problems. And with that, I'm going to go have a beer with my friend Tony sometime this week. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week right here in the same bad channel, same bad place on Democracy with FP Wellman. Have a great week.